When you offer an explication of a poem, close reading, your interpretation should incorporate most of the previously explained poetic terms, because this vocabulary adds to the meaning of a poem. For example, the poet may have integrated a certain rhyme scheme into the poem, or perhaps that poet did not. That decision was done for a specific reason, and your interpretation should be able to answer that question. What can help you explicate or interpret a poem is to break that work down line by line into smaller sections. For example, let's take this Shakespearean sonnet, otherwise known as Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. How do you feel when you encounter a poem like this? It can be quite intimidating at first, especially knowing that the poem was written by, quote, Shakespeare. However, if you read this poem more than once, interpreting the smaller chunks of the poem one at a time, you may understand the purpose behind the poem. Now, it might help you to know that this poem is also called a Shakespearean sonnet. A Shakespearean sonnet is defined as having 14 lines with a final rhymed couplet. It also means that it's written in iambic pentameter. Iambic means that the stresses of the words are in the second syllable. Let's bold the stressed syllables in that first line. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Each unstressed, stressed syllable in this section is a foot. Pentameter means that there are 5 of these stressed, unstressed feet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Pentameter. Again, each line of this sonnet is iambic pentameter. Now, imagine how difficult it could be to create this sort of poem. Iambic pentameter and sonnets in general have a rigid set of rules and gives a sense of formality to sonnets. Now let's look at the rhyme scheme. Day, May. That's a rhyme. Rate, date. That's another rhyme. So this we consider A, this we consider B. Then we got shines, declines, C, dimmed, untrimmed, D, fade, shade, E, O, oast, grossed, F. And then you had the final rhymed couplet. Obviously, this rhyme scheme adds to the poem's formal nature. However, each scheme also serves a purpose. It allows the reader to unite each rhyme section together into quatrains, sets of 4 lines. So day, May, rate, date, that's a set of 4 lines. That's a quatrain. And couplets, these are sets of 2 lines. These separate sections in a sonnet usually have one unified idea. That is, the rhyme sections also have a purpose. So remember, quatrain, set of 4 lines, couplet, set of 2 lines. So let's look at this first quatrain. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short of date. Let's look at the first line. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Should the narrator compare some mystery listener to a summer's day? That line isn't really hard to understand. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Thou means you. The narrator is referring to the mysterious listener, and the narrator is saying that the listener is more lovely, more beautiful, and more temperate, which means mild. If you aren't sure what a word is, for example, temperate, when you're explicating your chosen poem, you need to look up the word in the dictionary. Obviously, that will help you. However, you do not need to define the word in your essay if you're writing about a poem, unless the word has multiple definitions, and your choice of definition could potentially arrive at a different definition to your reader. So, let's look at the next line. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Summer has some rough weather that can harm beauty, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Well, summer doesn't last that long, right? Think of a lease. A renter's lease can be long-term or short-term. Summer's lease is short. Basically, in this first quatrain, the narrator states that he or she, and remember, we aren't sure if the narrator is Shakespeare or someone else. Don't assume that the narrator is the poet. The narrator states that he cannot compare, or she, or they, cannot compare the mysterious listener to a summer's day because the listener is more beautiful and more mild. So let's look at the next quatrain. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. This is an interesting metaphor, the eye of heaven. What can be too hot and shine somewhere in the heaven? Often, especially during the Elizabethan era, this is referred to as the sun. Let's look at the next line. And often is his gold complexion dimmed. Who is he now? Is this a person? Remember, each quatrain has a unifying point. Line 5 discusses the sun, and line 6 continues this discussion, uses personification, his gold complexion. Sometimes the sun dims, as not always bright. The next two lines are super tricky. I realize that. However, they work well together, so we're going to examine them both at the same time. And every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. What is fair from fair? Fair means beauty, so let's replace those words. And every beauty from beauty sometimes declines. With time, beauty declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. The word untrimmed, I realize, can be tricky. However, many believe that this word means that nature can cause beauty to fade. Now let's look at this final quatrain. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. The narrator has another metaphor, comparing the mysterious listener to eternal summer, one that will never fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. The narrator states that the mysterious listener will never lose possession of his, her, or they. We don't know what the sex of the narrator, right? Or the listener, right? Their beauty. Okay? Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. Right here. Here, Shakespeare is personifying death. However, he says, or the narrator, that death will not, nor take this mysterious listener. In other words, the mysterious, beautiful listener who is like an eternal mild summer will not die. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. This is another tricky line because there's a bit of play here. Lines could be lines of heritage, passing on gene pools, or it could be lines of poetry. This is where the personal interpretation comes into play. Let's say the narrator means lines of poetry. That is, the mysterious, beautiful listener will not die because the listener is growing in lines of poetry. Now, knowing all the above makes understanding the final couplet rather easy to understand. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to these. What is this? This is the sonnet. This sonnet will cause the mysterious, temperate, beautiful listener to live forever as a beauty because the sonnet will always exist, unaffected by sun and time. And you know what? Because we're still reading this sonnet today, He's accurate. This sonnet is accurate. So, what we've just done is a poetry explication. Your test this week in the forum will be to explicate a poem. Your chosen poem hopefully will be easier than this Shakespearean sonnet. However, please consider moving through the poem slowly and carefully like we just did here in order to arrive at your particular interpretation. I hope this helps a bit, but remember, always message your instructor if you have any questions or concerns.